I appreciate you guys being able to handle someone coming from the west. My name's Mark Heineman. I'm an agronomist for WinField United, and I work in Nebraska. So I cover Nebraska. We're going to set some things kind of equal of how it works, because crop growth and development within the plants when it comes to corn and soybeans grows the same, but in different environments we do different things. Some of you guys know that with some farms versus other farms. You guys manage them differently. So before we get into that, I really want to appreciate and tell you guys thank you for investing your time as well as your energy here this morning. You're sitting in an investment. When you guys do work with Superior Ag, you're now looking at dollars that are put towards helping you guys with management decisions. And so when we look at this stop here, we're going to talk about driving efficiency. Jim talked about nitrogen, and you guys hear a lot about nitrogen. We're going to get a little bit of that. But before we even get into that, when we think about crop growth and development, when I throw out the term harvest index, does that mean anything to you guys under the tent? It should, because that means to you guys your dollars that you're going to get, or the size of the ear, how many pods you're going to get. So before I get into this, we're going to look at a corn plant. So I got a corn plant here and above ground. When we get into what we call biomass accumulation, what we do is when it comes into physiological maturity, we come in here and we weigh the biomass from the above ground portion, and then what we do then is we take this ear, which we call harvest index. Okay, so then what we do is we take math and we go, out of all the biomass accumulation, my harvest index was what percent? And roughly on a 220 bushel corn crop, we've got a harvest index around 52%. How many are happy with the 52% harvest index? What do we think? Out of all this biomass, we get a 52% harvest index. And do we have to start that, or you keep an eye on it? Okay. I gotta keep an eye on that because I tend to get a little long-winded. So we got a harvest index of about 52%. How many want a 100% harvest index? That would be great, but if we have a 100% harvest index, what happens when you have a harvest index? You have nothing holding that ear up, and how many are able to pick up all that corn off the ground? Nope. So we can't get to a 100% harvest index, but we can become more efficient with a higher harvest index, and we'll walk into that a little bit. So on a 220 bushel corn crop, what's our harvest index roughly? What did we say? 52%. So remember harvest index. What is, what is our potential for a number of kernels on an ear of corn? Anybody got an idea? How about 500 kernels? 750? 1,000? There's about 1,000 kernel potential on an ear of corn. We get that by kernels around and kernels along. So we'll get into this going as well when we get in here a little bit further on how nutrition drives into that. Now, I'm going to grab a soybean plant. How many like growing corn more than soybeans? In my area, everybody will raise their hand in Nebraska. They just like corn. But we're starting to find more energy and excitement on beans now, though. But here I got a soybean, and so the same thing, I got Japanese beetles hatching out of there too. See that? Yeah. I got to throw them away. All right, so we got a soybean crop. Let's think about harvest index on a soybean crop. Out of the biomass, when that plant's done growing in size, we take that biomass and we get a harvest index. What do you think our harvest index is for beans versus corn? Is it higher or lower? It's actually lower. For about a 60 bushel corn crop, or 60 bushel soybean crop, it's about a 37-38% harvest index. How many are excited about a 37% harvest index? No? Well, some of you guys, what have you been started doing with your population on soybeans? Have you been increasing or decreasing? Decreasing. Why are you doing that? Saving more money. We're going to get done with today. You're going to say, I'm redistributing that money somewhere else. I'm not going to keep it all. I'm going to find a different way to put it. That makes a lot of sense. So we got a 37% harvest index on a 60 bushel soybean crop. You guys dropped your population. What happened to your harvest index when you dropped your population? It went up. Now you guys check the box when you drop the population. How did you say that was successful? What happened when you harvested that crop? A lot of times my guys tell me the yield stayed the same. How many saw that? Or you saw the yield go up? Well, both cases the harvest index went up. But as we drop our population, we're going to have to ask this crop to be a higher harvest index. We drop less population out there, we're going to have to get a higher harvest index on this. Now let's get a little bit further into the plant. We talked about corn, where that harvest index and the bushels come from. On a soybean plant, I'm going to separate it into thirds, and we're going to get into that a little bit further. But let's say here's the bottom third, middle third, and top third. Okay, out of the soybean harvest index, where's the highest yield potential, or the highest yield that we get? Is it the bottom third, middle third, or top third? Middle. Absolutely, middle. So should we just stay with that? What I'm going to talk about today is it's interesting because when you guys ask us, or the worst and the most funnest time we get as an agronomist, you guys, all right, what should I do? So the challenge is back onto us. Well, to understand this a little bit more is, where's our yield contributing from? What portion of the plant when it comes to the soybeans, and what part on that corn crop? So we got to think through the way they get planted on that soybean crop. So, any questions on this around harvest index, biomass? It's important. That's your guys' money ball. When we think about both corn and soybeans, your harvest index is what we want to do. Okay? Now, let's go to efficiency. There's two kinds of plant-nutrient interactions. There's a synergism, which is a positive response, and there's an antagonism, which is a negative effect between nutrients. This is inside that plant. These interactions are influenced by things like soil type, plant, or the physical properties, pH, ambient and soil temperature, proportion of that participating, or how much of those nutrients are in that plant has effect on these interactions. Now let's drive a little bit into the synergism. On an optimum supply of nitrogen, we get an optimum uptake of potassium, phosphorus, magnesium, iron, manganese, and zinc. Why do we spend a lot of time on nitrogen? You look at this chart, it directly has a lot of action that happens on a lot of other nutrients. You think about something like copper and boron, we get optimum levels of copper and boron in the plant. That improves the uptake of nitrogen. So we're going to get to how we couple some of this stuff together when we're putting on our crop nutrition. So this is a list from plant physiologists, soil scientists, and biochemists trying to clarify a really complicated interaction between nutrients. Okay? Now let's flip over to an antagonism now. Now if we put too much nitrogen on, that can reduce the uptake of potassium, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, zinc, manganese, copper, iron. You know what? That list actually grew. In my area, there's some areas where we were putting too much nitrogen on. We weren't being efficient with looking at other nutrients with it. And when we're asking for 300, 320 for bushels, and we're putting that about 300, 320 pounds of nitrogen, it has a direct shot on some of these other nutrients in these interactions, both in the soil and both as well in the plant. And we'll get into some specific examples of that. But first, how do we measure all this? You guys are taking soil samples. How many of you are out there when you're doing your fertility in a dry program and you're variable rating it in different zones, as well as maybe different parts of that field, right? We're doing that. Another one is, you've heard about tissue samples. I can't stress this enough, is including that plant into our fertility program is vital. So there's other ways people are looking at. They're looking at cell sap and so forth out in my area, but when we look at tissue sample, it helps us get an idea of what the plant's saying, because sometimes the plant's not getting what our soil says is available, and that gets influenced by some of that weather environment. So as you look at it, how many have seen a NutriSolutions tissue sample? Okay, if you're looking at it, we just give you a bullseye right away. If you're out on the green, it means you're adequate, and then if you're in the yellow, responsive, and if you're in the red, you're deficient. I got a picture over here. This is at V4 corn. you're looking at the deficiencies, and Jim put one up there on his farm. But this is something that really catches us a lot is if we go off of just visual deficiencies, we're probably going to be in error. We got to get a little bit more understanding of what's going on out there. When I went out there and tissue sampled that, we had a boron deficiency, a zinc deficiency, and a magnesium deficiency. How many are putting those nutrients on at that time or want to? Probably not, unless we look at plant physiological stage and see if that's worth it. And now if you go down into here, we tell you if you're going to put on a magnesium, here's some product that you could use, but this magnesium is essential for chlorophyll, photosynthesis, and carbohydrate production and dry matter accumulation. That sounds like something that's more important later on than it is right now. Okay, so that's how we make some of our decisions off that. But if we're looking at boron and zinc, those are helpful with reproductive stage. And what are we starting to do at V4? Ear initiations, kernels around. Now, you guys, when you pick out your hybrid, how many have seen on your hybrid there's a range of kernels around? You guys see that when you pick your hybrid? Usually it says it's something like 16 to 20, 14 to 18. Why is that? Ever think about that? Well, that's happening early on at V4 to V6, and nutrients that drive that, well, let's just back up here, Mark. Most of that is determined by the genetics, but I'm going to throw out something to us here is nutrients like nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, zinc, boron are critical for getting a cell elongation, cell division, cell differentiation, which at that V4, V5 stage is important for kernels around. Now I went out there to the nitrogen station and I picked 2 ears of a 5497 and 2 different management practices. Which ear looks better? The north one, right? I'll just go with north. The north one does in the south. And the reason why we say that is because what looks different? Guess what? But if I look at the kernels, it's the same kernels around. This wasn't the kernel density, kernel depth is the effect. This is where we ran short of nitrogen, and this is where we had enough nitrogen, and it seems like we're going to have enough later on in the season. In my areas, if we're too short early on, we will affect kernels around. And when I talk to you guys about these genetic potentials, kernels around, when we start doing things like with our starter or an early post application, we're able to drive that more of that plant population from 14 kernels up to 16 to 18. Does that sound like something good for your harvest index? Everybody should be shaking their head. Yes, because we're about harvest index. We're trying to get as high harvest index as we can. That's an amount of kernels. If I increase two kernels around on 30,000 population, what does that mean for yield for you guys? How many bushels is that, roughly? Over 20. That's a big change. That's something that happened early on in that plant. So as we plant these genetics, they really, really want to be helped and to have a good time throughout the whole season, and nutrition has a play into that. So what I really get into anymore is we tend to compartmentalize our decision when we write out that check for our nutrients. What I mean by that is okay, my nitrogen program, this is how many pounds of nitrogen I'm going to put on my crop. And then I'm going to come over to phosphorus, and after my soil samples and where I'm at, this is how much phosphorus I'm going to put on. What I want us to start doing is blending them together now. And it'll make sense when we get into this, because what I want us to think about is as you're out there within your corn crop this year, go out there and see, okay, how many rows around am I versus where I'm on that range on that hybrid? Am I on the lower side, middle side, or top side? That'll help us out with a decision, right? With the management practice. If I'm now looking at on length, we'll get into this. How am I holding through maybe some stressful conditions, some warm weather or some heat that we tend to get out there as well as we're experiencing here this morning? Okay, but ultimately, when we start doing analysis of our crops, we're ultimately wanting to know where's it at in the crop growth and development stage. And then when we do some measuring of it, if there's a deficiency of it, and let's just say at V4, what are we wanting that plant to do? Or what is that plant wanting to do? Let's throw out some things it's trying to do. Make it ear. Yeah, ear initiation. So that's a reproductive stage. So what I want us to focus on, if that's a reproductive stage, and I look at nutrients that are involved in reproductive, I just talked about it. Phosphorus, calcium. You're going to look over here with boron, copper, zinc. Those are really critical with that, okay? So if I are going out there and measuring, and if I'm deficient in one of those, that's going to have an effect on reproductive and primarily what? Kernels around. That plant's also trying to develop root development. Well, if I'm short of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, sulfur, zinc, I'm going to impact my roots. Do you guys like good roots out here? Yeah. That's going to impact that if I'm short on some of these nutrients. That's where I challenge a lot of our guys into that is, let's get a little more specific of what that plant's trying to do, and then out of what it's trying to do, if I'm deficient with one of those nutrients, let's pair it up, if it has to be, with the recommendation that we put on. So, any questions that we got into this quick?
What determines the length of an ear? I mean, you talked a lot about the number of kernels around, but kernels long.
I'm glad you asked. I got a perfect example. So thanks, Ron. We're going to get into that right after this. So, here is an example first of an antagonism. So we said there was two types of what? Plant interactions. There's synergism and antagonism. Is antagonism something we want to have happen? No. But one thing that I saw early on in my career 15, 20 years ago is I put way too much of nitrogen on in that soil. It shocks that soil. That environment now gets shocked by too much, and it impacts and has a negative effect on there. This one's now looking at zinc specific. How many use zinc or put zinc on for your crops? Everybody raise your hand. Because this is a critical micronutrient. But let's look at in the soil now. We're going to look at the soil. Zinc impacts iron. So if I got zinc out of control too high, it will impact iron in the soil. And then it also gets impacted by calcium and phosphorus. How many of you guys use manure as a source for nutrition? We got a lot of our areas when we get into beef feedlot and in some of my hogs finishing barns, we use a lot of that. We get so much phosphorus in the soil that's impacting my zinc uptake. And so I have to now think about what form of zinc or how can I allow that to be more available on a zinc availability for that plant. Now, let's get into this. We just talked about in the soil. Let's look at in the plant. There's a synergism and antagonism. Now, if I get optimum zinc in the plant, that improves my phosphorus and potassium. See these relationships now? That come into play a little bit. And then if I get an antagonism, an excessive amount of zinc can reduce up my manganese. So if I put too much zinc on, it can reduce my manganese availability. And so this got me interested, and we did some trials to look at this last one on an antagonism level. And this is what we did. So out of 4 of my answer plots over multiple years, I looked at this zinc-manganese interaction. And what I want to do is see how that looked in that plant. And so I'm going to show you a little bit here is I use a product called Ultra Key 9% zinc. Ultra Key 9% zinc at 1 quart, and then 2 quarts, 4 quarts, and then I use another product here which has got manganese in it with it. And what I want you to look at here is as I increase my amount of zinc, look at my amount of manganese when I get really high here. So and here's untreated with the light blue. So if I only ran 1 quart of Ultra Key 9% zinc, I had a 35 parts per million zinc concentration, or manganese concentration. Where I used, let me look. It's been a while, so that's in zinc. So manganese, here's 129. So as I put more zinc on, I increase zinc concentration in the plant, don't I? See how I do that? And then where I just use that Ultra Key corn mix, which is zinc, manganese, and copper, that's equal to amount of zinc in 1 quart here. So we stayed there. But now let's look at this antagonism effect between zinc and manganese. As I put on more zinc, what's starting to happen to my concentration of manganese in my plant? Is it going up or down? See that relationship that's happening? As I flood that plant too much, how many times do you guys put a nutrient on, it works, and you say, well, I'm going to put more on? I know none of you guys do. In Nebraska, we do sometimes. This is the effect that I wanted to show us. We see value in that nutrient, and then I'm going to push more. Well, here's some things that happens with the relationship, and this is an antagonism now. So if I put too much zinc, see how we drive more zinc in that plant, but what happens to our manganese level? And this is a bad day for our crops because manganese has an impact on our development as well in photosynthetates and how we run photosynthesis. So we're excessive here, but when I get too much, I actually now become responsive with manganese in my plant. What's neat is, if I look at a combination product, which is zinc, manganese, and copper, which is this corn mix, look at our levels. I'm able to hold because at no zinc, I'm deficient, but when I put 1 on, I actually get more zinc concentration in there. But when I have some manganese in there, look at, I'm holding my manganese level closer to where if I didn't have it in there. So this is the relationship between these nutrients that we're starting to see that's important out there. All right, I love doing a lot of these meetings, and I do a lot of them around a lot of areas. And there's a grower that came up in the area that I was talking around in 2016, and he goes, Mark, that sounds great. What should I do? And so this is a grower's information of what he started to put in place of what we were talking about with interactions between nutrients and how he worked in here. Now this is utilizing fertigation. We got some fertigation that goes on in Nebraska. I know probably not as much in here, but on my farm, we're dry land. I utilize a dry program that works a lot this in here, as well as some foliar feeding. So how many have utilized foliar feeding? How many utilize dry program? This is some things that you can apply. But here's a grower. After I got done speaking in 2017, we switched a couple things up. He's a grower that's utilizing a whole bunch of ammonia up front, and then he comes back and he fertigated once with 28-005. And so after a discussion of asking him kernels around and kernels in length, how many know where you sit on kernels around and kernels in length? When I asked him that, he goes, well, I don't know, this is where my yield is, right? But as where we're making some decisions, we need to know where that is because it helps us out with what we're just going to walk through right here. So what I changed up is we did 2 fertigation events. We did one at V12 and one at tassel time. And we used analysis of a 26033. What are the nutrients involved in that? We got N. How much P in there? Then what? And then sulfur. Okay, so I heard the analysis of a 28-004. There's a lot of what we use out there is a 28-005. So we know there's a synergism between nitrogen and sulfur. What I'm now pulling together is a potassium synergism between nitrogen and sulfur, because that plant takes that nutrient up in nitrogen, but it's got to go and create an enzyme called nitrate reductase to break that down. Potassium's a key nutrient that's involved in that. So we did those 2 applications. He had a 32.5 population on both of these different variables, and I'm going to walk through this a little bit. So rows around, when's that determined? And there's another variable that he did here is he goes, Mark, I don't know if starter is valuable. Anybody scratch your head and say that, ask your question that sometimes? So we put that in the question here is he did what we call the low fertility, which is the dark green and the red. That's without starter. And then the high fertility's got starter as well as this fertigation event. So now, as we put the test there, we put a starter on, rows around, and there's a Pioneer hybrid here in the green. The dark green has no starter, and the light green has starter. Did we increase kernels around? Yeah. And then if we look at the dekalb hybrid, did we increase kernels around from the starter? Absolutely. Then when we get into rows long, so when's length starting to happen here? What stage in the corn plant? V8, V9, anybody okay with me saying that? That's about when we start doing in kernels and length, right? And so when I'm doing it in here, I'm feeding it there as well as when I get closer to the numbers of established kernels and length at tassel time here. So now let's look at our rows long. Here's where we didn't have the fertigation, and here's where we did, 36 to 38. How many are excited about that? A little bit of movement. On the dekalb, went from 35 to 37, so we saw some movement here. But now here's some things that I challenge my guys is you got your ear of corn. What I want you to start looking at is the amount of abortion that happened. Because if I have abortion, is that a negative to our harvest index? You bet it is. As well as if I got skips out here, is that valuable to us on this ear? Not at all. They should be arranged perfectly, and if I don't, I'm having a problem on that. So now let's look at this. On my low fertility, here's abortion. Did I have less abortion on my low fertility than my high fertility? Oh boy, I'm in trouble. Right? Because if I told you to do that, you guys would call me out on that, right? Because I see some yield increase, but do I have some room and improvement to do? Yes. So I have some kernel abortion, and was it just on the Pioneer, or did it happen on the dekalb? Helping on the dekalb as well. So we got some improvements to talk about on that, as well as look at our skips. What did we do to our skips? Did we improve our number of skips? Reduce it down? So our fertility helped out on skips, but we got one little factor here, and we'll get to that. Total kernels. So if you just take roughly 85 or 90, you can get your bushels, but I want my people thinking about harvest index and how that is done. So the amount of kernels, we had 571 on the low fertility and 687 on the high fertility. Do you think that paid? And then I got 597 on dekalb and 662 on the high fertility. Okay, now, what do you think we had a discussion about after he got done harvesting? Where do you think his attention went to right away? Yeah. So, 2018. I'm using this information because the grower allowed me to use this. A lot of guys that we're working with, we're starting to do some things that are differently, so they get a little bit tighter with their information. But this is what we did in 2018. Remember, we had 26033, right? But now I changed a couple things. I added boron in there, and I added a product which I already talked about, which is Ultra Key Corn Mix. And this product's got zinc, manganese, and copper in it. And I put that on at that fertigation event of V12 and VT. And then our yield components was at 33. He got a little tough on me because he had 2 examples. This year he only has what? 1. And this happens to be on a Pioneer hybrid. Now let's look at how we did. And then I should say we fungicided as well at tassel time. How many are utilizing fungicide? We're starting to build that into our programs the last 3-4 years. A lot of guys are building that in the program. So we had fungicide in there. Now let's look at our ways we develop our yield. Kernels around. We went from 17.6 to 18.4. Okay. Rows length, 38 to 42. What do we do on the abortion, though, that we wanted to talk about? We got a lot of tighter, still not as good as the last, but question to you is, as I get a bigger ear, how hard is it to hold it into the tip? How many have ever seen that? I used to work with guys that would say, I like to see a little tip back. Anybody still say that today? I don't like that. We should have kernels clear out to the tip, because if we do, what's our management program like? Pretty darn good. What's your harvest index doing? it's also higher as well, right? So why did we see this? Well, it's back to this. You look at reproductive, one of the main couple things that we built into this was zinc and boron for that reproductive, right? As well as copper. What was I doing adding those in there? Trying to help us out with kernels and length to reduce that reduction right here. Okay? Yes?
I was always told if you filled all the way to the tip, you didn't have a high enough population.
Okay, so how do you guys...
Some tip back, you already have full potential.
If you have full... Okay, have you guys ever used... this is stepping in what we do here. How do you guys determine your population around here?
Genetic guide sees your crop here for soil.
Okay. How many have ever heard the phrase, for every 1,000 kernels you plant, you should have at least 8 bushels for that? How many have heard that before? If you ever listened to Randy Dowdy or Robert Hula, they say you should be at 10 per 1,000 kernels. So take your population, let's say 30,000 times 8. What's that bushels need to be? 240. They're saying before we try to think about, and this is general, if we start to even think about adding our more population, I should be at what yield potential? Right? And to me, now 240, it's even deeper than that. How many kernels around, how much in length, because then that helps me out with our nutritional program. I don't like to see that kernel back because we just lost harvest index and kernel potential. And what we can utilize is math to see where we roughly need to be. So how many have looked at your population and saw that you're not to 8 yet? So those are some questions to ask. So, boy, I appreciate the time.